Jemal Countess is a photojournalist with over 3 decades of experience, beginning his career in 1990 at Washington, D.C.'s Community News after early inspiration from iconic photographers like Larry Burroughs and Sebastião Salgado. He spent years shooting music legends such as Chaka Khan and Grace Jones, while contributing to international publications before joining Wire Image in 2003 and later Getty Images in 2007. From 2007 to 2015, Jemal covered major film festivals and high-profile events in New York, then relocated to Ethiopia to document regional and global news. Returning to Washington, D.C. in 2019, Jemal now focuses on politics, breaking news, and corporate projects while pursuing personal book and documentary projects on Christianity and Judaism in the 21st century. His latest work, This Was Once Your Home, is a monograph based on his coverage of the 2020 Ethio-Tigray War and the oppression and erasure of the Amhara people, and is set to be released in April of 2026. So it's been released now, so it's available for purchase. And again, you can visit our brother Jemal's profile to access the link, everyone. So Brother Jemal, if you want to share just some brief words just to greet everybody, if there's anything on your mind before we move into the questions.
Yeah, I would like to ask for a moment of silence for the victims of the RC massacre and the aftermath. So if we could just start with a pause, honestly, a pause in silent prayer. Okay. Yeah, this hits kind of hard, simply because as I've had to reflect on, you know, what it took to put the book together, I started to think about what it took, or what my experience in Ethiopia was on my journey towards orthodoxy, and I go back to that first Kalubi Gabriel um, uh, pilgrimage. I guess it's such a short experience. I don't know if we can call it a pilgrimage per se, but my first trip to Kalubi Gabriel, and just the level of kindness and kind of unseen um, humanity, Christianity that I had not seen in my entire life in the West before. So all of these things kind of form or are playing in the background as I try to process, this latest massacre, the massacres that I recorded during the war that were affected against the church and, faithful people. So, yeah, this is different. It's getting a lot more outside attention. I don't know if, somebody raised an interesting point for me this week where they were like, well, the amount of attention it's getting is unusual. There's so much being spoken about this massacre and the government's kind of quiet. Like, the cadres can't say anything about this because you have multiple international sources picking this story up. So then the conspiratorial side is like, well, what if this is just all part of some bigger power play where we actually end up with outside forces coming in as peacekeepers or moderators, and we basically lose more control of certain aspects of our existence, But then I'm like, no, well, the point is people are finding out. I don't really think that it's like part of a larger plan or conspiracy or what can you call it? Tactical maneuver to inject more foreign interference into Ethiopia. I think it's just that people are finding out. The government doesn't quite know what to do when you have multiple international media outlets reporting on the massacre masked by an election. You know, the timing is uncanny. The timing is just like anybody who's kind of studied international politics and different, uprisings and movements and corrupt governments over the course of history will realize that people do one thing to mask another thing when they have nefarious intentions. So, but I'm just glad that people are starting to understand and people are really responding to this situation in RC and the situation with the Orthodox Church with a greater intensity, and international outlets are finding out about it. So,
Thank you so much for that, Brother Jamal, and really, really insightful points. I think it's very timely to remember the victims of what happened in RC. This was really something that galvanized communities worldwide. As we said earlier, there's been candlelight vigil events held in multiple parts of the world, from North America to Europe, Australia, and beyond. Just earlier today, I attended a virtual event hosted by our brothers and sisters in Belgium. And so it's great to see that. It's great to see people coming together. Although, what's happened is tragic, I think it's become a cause for people to unite, to come together, and not only in sorrow and sadness, but also with determination to see an end to this violence. Because what's been happening to the Amhara people, what's been happening to followers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is not new. It's been something that's been going on for quite some time. Even if we look at just the RC area, this has been something that's been going on since at least the 1990s. And then since the new administration came into power in 2018, we've seen a rise in the incidences of attacks. So, since 2021, upwards of 30 attacks in the RC area alone, and arguably RC isn't even the worst part of Oromia in terms of the violence. If you look at Welkait-Tegede, there was possibly hundreds of attacks or maybe more. So what's been happening is very tragic. It's very widespread. It's systematic, with state complicity, and I think sometimes what was happening in that part of the country was overshadowed by conflict in other parts of the country. And so I think that is a good segue, Brother Jamal, to the subject matter of the book, which focused on the war in northern Ethiopia. And so that brings me to my first question, which was, Brother, you've made a number of trips between late 2020 and early 2022, from my understanding, to Ethiopia. What first brought you to the conflict zone, and what kept bringing you back?
it was information that I was getting from the ground. I I kept in touch with my students who I taught photography, various friends in different parts of the country that I had gotten to know through just living in Ethiopia, going traveling to different parts for different holidays, being the resident tourist, et cetera, et cetera. So I was just hearing that from the ground. What I was hearing from the ground was completely opposite of what was coming out in the mainstream media, if anything was coming out in the mainstream media at all. If you want to talk about, 1 minute, 1 minute 20 sound bites, 45-second sound bites, we weren't getting a lot of detail in the West. But when we would switch on Ethiopian television, we would hear a whole different, scenario. And there were no real major media, like, how can I say, like major, major outlets that were reporting with a detail. It was just an overall summary of this. Oh, Mai-Kadra massacre, whatever, Northern War, etc. Like cramming whatever they can into like 60 seconds, with a little brief video clip. So I wanted to go. Especially after hearing about what was happening in Mexico. And I was like, there needs to be some clarity. There needs to be some clarity. And these claims of cannibalism and what have you, and who's really involved, need to really be scrutinized and brought to light. So I made the trip to Chagny in December of 2020. Um, and that just kind of sealed my fate. Um, I I was just kind of jarred into this sense of like the painful reality of what people are facing just based upon their ethnicity. And Chagny had nothing to do with the TPLF directly. It was more or less Sheni, OLF, OLA, Oromo extremists, Gumus, backing the Gumus, with possible involvement from Egypt. Um, so that was, and the brutality, the sheer brutality of those testimonies that I recorded in Chagny, just kind of did something to me, and I realized that this needs attention. And I remember when I submitted my story, my coverage, to my editor. My editor was just kind of, in shock. He's like, "Listen, no offense to you, but I have to really go in and um, just scrutinize this before we publish it, because it's a big responsibility to claim the level of brutality and cannibalism that was existing or reported in Mexico, you know. So, he took some time to do the research, and then, we released the story. And then the following story was going back to Mai-Kadra, because, as you know, Mai-Kadra, there were so many stories being thrown around about who was who and who actually suffered during the course of the massacre in Mai-Kadra, that I was like, well, we need to cover this too. And other agencies went as well. So, I just discovered that, and I was convicted to really pursue the truth across all channels and all regions, because, like I said, there was such a strong and deeply entrenched propaganda machine already in place. And, we're fighting against that. So it's like, you think about the people who had already suffered so much and who were brutalized through the course of ethnic cleansing operations and massacres and offenses. Um, um, they needed a voice. They needed to have their stories told, and mainstream media wasn't quite doing it. There were some instances where people would go and they might talk to one or two IDPs or refugees or survivors, but I'm like, no, we need to explore the reason behind it and the why. It's not just like some media outlet would just say, oh, well, the war between such and such, between the government and forces of Tigray, caused this in Dakota. It was just like, well, why? Why so? Why so? What's the deeper meaning behind it? What's the deeper history? How long have these people actually been suffering with this war on their ethnicity and their religion? So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jamal. Really a lot to unpack there, especially, about the situation in Metekel and other parts of the country, the involvement of different actors, to Sekota, which is now currently a war zone, right? As the war in the Amhara region continues. This is a region that's seen about 5 years of consecutive war now. You still have involvement of these regional forces, sometimes under different namings. For example, just over the past week, there was involvement of the so-called Tigray Peace Force, or Simret, which was literally shelling civilian communities in that area. So very, very devastating. And I think, what you said brought up so many interesting questions about the trip, and I think there's so much to unpack there. So I was very curious, how did the title "This Was Once Your Home" come about, and what does it mean to you?
Um, it's directly tied to the cover, and it's directly tied to Welkait. Um, so the cover image shows the gentleman who served as our guide, who took us to the death camps, the various torture and death camps located in Welkait, where ethnic Amharas were taken to be reconditioned or killed. And the final leg of the trip, as we were leaving Addis-Ababa, he took me to 4 mass graves where they had, exhumed the remains of multiple groups of individuals, 24 in one grave, 4 in another grave, 28 in another grave, and then another grave that was still in the process of being exhumed. So he's standing next to a mass grave that had just recently been unearthed and excavated. And the information that we had gathered from the residents of Addis-Ababa was that when people were marched from the death camp, they were marched down that road that cuts next to the town out into those hills, and they were disappeared. So, and then I heard that basically during that whole exercise to rid or to change the demographic of Welkait, that some 50,000 plus ethnic Amharas had been disappeared. So that region behind him potentially is just a vast expanse of mass graves. And, you hear the stories from the locals where after heavy rains, there would be bones that would wash down river or be discovered. That you would find people trying to dig foundations for homes or construction or dig wells, and they come across remains. Addis-Ababa itself was a town built on a mass grave, or mass graves plural. So you have this whole tragic story of people who were disappeared and forced out of a region that they called their home, that had been their ancestral land for hundreds of years. And just because a woman in England and, our State Department and CIA wanted to, ingratiate and please, the TPLF, they basically rewrote the borders and created this whole Western Tigray narrative. So it hit me a certain way that he was basically standing, amongst the remains of how many hundreds of people could possibly be found and located in those hills. And those people who used to live in Welkait were basically sent to Gehenna and multiple other sites of torture and death camps throughout Welkait, and disappeared mostly. Some were just imprisoned for a large amount of years, for many years. And there's a lot of Welkaites who live outside of Ethiopia now, all across the world, who can look back at that region and say, I used to live here. I used to live in this place. And, pictures of loved ones who were journeying from one town to another and who were disappeared and never made it, So, yeah, that's the inspiration,
Thank you so much, Brother Jamal, for sharing that. It really gives a whole new meaning to the name, especially when you know the context and what the stories behind that were. Of course, this is something that can be related to many of the areas that were covered in your trips and travels, but specifically on Welkait-Tegede-Setit and Adlemt. This was territory that was under TPLF occupation for a very long period, since the 1990s and even before then. And I think it was interesting the mention of Gehenna, which is literally Amharic for hell. So these concentration camps were just extremely horrific, very, very brutal, with research from Gondar University indicating at least 59,000 detainees being held in these facilities. So this was something that was very, very horrific, with human remains, in some cases, even with remains that could be seen still wearing the clothing. So that's something that is a very dark chapter in the history of Ethiopia, but also in world history, really. And it's great to see that this book can start to shed light on what transpired in some of these places, complementing some of the research that's also come out. So going to my next question, what do you hope readers understand after seeing the images and stories in this book?
That the Amhara existence is under existential threat. And they need to go back and look at I'll call it the The Berlin Conference, the seeds of the Berlin Conference that were planted that basically led, countrymen to turn on their own brothers and sisters, their own fellow countrymen, to basically eradicate them, to wipe them out, because that was the objective of the European powers or the Western powers after the Battle of Adwa. They realized that, the backbone of the resistance had to be broken, and that the country needed to be socially divided and fragmented in order for there to be a successful conquering and occupation and what would I say? In balkanizing of Ethiopia. So, yeah, yeah. I still have a kind of because everything kind of runs together at some point. Like I mentioned before, I went to Rwanda several times to do a good bit of research, and I'm looking at, even now, looking at South Africa, looking at, the things that are coming out in the past couple of hours or days, where they're finding out who is actually funding these xenophobic attacks and who's actually funding this division in the country. And South Africa is eating itself alive right now. It's eating itself alive. They've gone from pushing out Mozambicans and assassinating Ethiopian businessmen and pushing out Zimbabweans to now not even accepting the music of anyone outside of South Africa, not accepting the contributions of anyone who has contributed to the social fabric of the country if they're not South African. So, and all of that comes down to just people kind of losing focus and not understanding, your enemies will go to extreme lengths to destroy you. So, yeah, I just kind of lost track of the question, but it just kind of triggered, all of that.
No problem.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a lot of things to reflect on there, especially as we see the current state of the hatred and division that's being sown. It's important to understand where it originated from, right? And, when it comes to Ethiopia's history as, the only African country to defeat colonialism and maintain its independence, this is something that went down in world history as, profound. The Battle of Adwa
Hmm.
under the leadership of Emperor Menelik. In fact, earlier this month, we even saw a new House resolution in the United States, in the state of Pennsylvania, recognizing the victory of Adwa Day
Hmm.
locally. So, this is something that stretches beyond Ethiopia and is a symbol for Black people and even maybe other oppressed people across the world.
Yeah.
So it's a huge legacy, and um, no, it's a shame when the people who are descendants of those freedom fighters find themselves being targeted in their
Hmm.
own country where they're native, where they're trying to live peaceful lives. Um, and so I think this brings me to another question, which is, what was the most difficult part of turning these experiences into a published book?
You have to relive everything. Um, when you go through the book and you look at the testimony of the women who survived Mai-Kadra, but who had to watch their husbands and their brothers and uncles being slaughtered, to Alamu's testimony, to the IDP experiences, down to, the Welkait experience, the Afar experiences, people who had nothing to do with anything, just basically being devastated, you know? You have to relive all of that. It's not just a matter of captioning photos, right? Because the news caption is one thing. A news caption is 3 to 5 sentences that goes out to international publications. For this, you have to really go back into your notes, and if you're reading the notes that you took on that day in Mai-Kadra or in Chena or in any of these other places, and there's little side notes. There's like, when you look at Getty or AFP and you see 3 sentence caption, there's usually like a page of notes behind that. And it's like, I'll record certain things, or I'll remember a survivor's tears, their passion, everything that they were feeling. Because for a person to recount that day of loss to you, they have to kind of open up and take the scab off of a wound. So you're looking into the bare, raw essence of a person's, their pain, their emotional experience. So that's hard. That's PTSD inducing. That's PTSD, you know, everything you thought you dealt with, you find out that it's just, you just put a Band-Aid on it and you're navigating through it. So, yeah, yeah, that's what makes it hard. Yeah. Because you think about it, like every time I look at, Timer's photo, and I think about the fact that even after we saw her at that camp and hike, that she went back to Walega, and that a young girl can sit there and make the decision, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die with my family. That resonates with you because, excuse me, you may find yourself like you looking at photo from like Walega, again, massacres, and you're wondering, did she survive? Was her family there? Was she there? And you go through that, and that traumatizes you, and it makes you think like, you know, shit, it hits you. So doing this book helped to kind of bring everything back to the fore, and then everything that's happening now, it doesn't help at all. I knew people in Piazza. I knew people in Casanchez. I used to patronize little mom and pop businesses in Casanchez and Piazza, and they're gone now. They're bike lanes, you know? So, yeah, it's pretty, it's challenging, it's challenging. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's so much to be said about how what's happening isn't limited to the rural parts of the country or the peripheries. This is something that's very much happening even in the center, in the urban centers, in the capital city.
Hmm.
As you said, parts of Addis-Ababa, for many Ethiopians, Addis-Ababa used to represent, this cradle of African unity where there's so much heritage, dating back to that period of, the defeat of the colonial powers and the victorious, African warriors, coming to this central part to begin to settle and to make lives after this heroic adventure. And, having seen, the people who are descendants of that, watch their homes, their heritage, their everything that they grew up with just demolished and erased. This is an erasure of Ethiopia's identity. This is an extension of the genocide against the Amhara people.
Hmm.
For example, for me personally, I can say in my own family, I have family members who were, descendants of the founders of that city. I'm sure many others can say similar things. And, I can, if, even from a personal level, I know of a lot of heritage being lost. And
Hmm.
it's completely a reflection of what we've seen, attacks against Amhara communities, against Orthodox Christians all over the country. The erasure of Amhara identity in Welkait-Tegede, the erasure of Amhara identity in Raya, what's happening currently in Welega and Arsi, and throughout the Amhara region. So this is not something that has happened in a vacuum. I think people need to understand that this is all connected. This is all interconnected,
Hmm.
and we have to really, really come to that understanding before we can move forward to the solution. Because if people are not willing to see the full picture, we have a problem.
Yeah.
And so, this brings me to another question. I think you touched on this in your previous response, but just to ask it in a kind of a different way. The
Hmm.
book is described as a visual record of the plight and suffering of the Amhara and the Afar people.
Hmm.
And why was it important to document this visually rather than only through written reporting, as some articles do?
Pictures are, an undeniable record. They are basically, yeah, now we have AI and what have you, but basically, just so that people know that the wire services do not allow AI generated images or heavily altered images at all. It's like our standards are, if you submit an image from a story, very minimal Photoshop, very minimal toning, let alone there's no AI usage, and AI was not widespread when I produced most of these photos. So what happens is you're looking at something and the captions accompany the photos. That's just the industry standard. They come with the captions, but at the same time, it's like the pictures kind of stand alone. They need to stand alone, and they can convey the story of what's happening. You know, so I think the visual images have always had a very powerful impact in relating major events in world history. You think back about certain things that have happened through time, and it's just like people didn't really move until they saw the photo, until they saw photos from that event. You think about Napalm Girl in Vietnam. You think about My Lai massacre photos. You think about the impact that the Falling Man photo had during 9/11. You think about so many other images and so many other events in time that were basically, the writing was incredible from the journalists on the ground, but the images basically crystallized people's, how can I say, awareness and thoughts and understanding of the situation. So, I mean, when I went to cover these events, when I went on these trips, I would actually take a great deal of photos leading into the region. I remember when I left Dancha going into Welkait, I photographed going all the way up to that bridge that leads into Welkait proper, and I photographed. There's a lot of landscapes in my different takes, so it's like I could have like 2,000 images from a trip to just one IDP camp, because I wanted people to see when the time came to see what you're going into. I mean, you have the beauty that is the landscape of Ethiopia. And then you pass through this beautiful landscape into this particular area, this scar full of death and despair and raw emotions and pain. So it's part of the complete story. You know, you kind of, it's like the introduction, you have the meat of the story, you have the climax, and then you have the post, or the prologue, I guess. And that's what it's like to leave, you know, Emabet, you know, that IDP camp that I went to, leaving that and photographing the beauty of the countryside as you're going back to Bahar Dar and the sun is setting, but you just left this whole group of boys who, in some cases, escaped from Sakota on foot because they didn't want to be conscripted. They left their families behind, or their families told them to go ahead in front of them because they didn't want them to get caught by the TPLF. You think about, you going back to the Walega stories, you know, you think about people who walked from Walega, and they walked through some of the most beautiful countryside in Africa, in my opinion. I mean, just somebody who really has kind of traveled a bit. It's like Rwanda rivals parts of Gondar and let's say Arbermensch, parts of the north and the south of the country in terms of beauty. But you understand how much pain has existed or took, you know, or was experienced within these beautiful landscapes, you know? So, yeah, pictures are crucial. Pictures are crucial to this type of storytelling.
Mhm. Certainly, I think that's a really good way of putting it, and it's so unfortunate, you know, how across Africa you have such beautiful land and such amazing people, and yet there's so much violence and so much conflict just being stirred, right, by all of these, you know, external forces and then problems that once they get started become very difficult to resolve. So it's really a shame, and I think that ties into another question. But before I get to the question, you know, this repeated discussion of Wedlega is so crucial, I believe, because when we talk about targeting of Amhara people, Wedlega is clearly one of the epicenters, especially since this administration came to power. Right, we were
Hmm.
seeing very, very, very deadly violence in the years leading up to now, and something that continues by a number of actors, state and non-state, and sometimes where the lines get blurred, right? Where we're not even sure if these non-state groups are even, you know, really rebels or if they're just working with the authorities as an arm to commit the genocide, to wipe out this population. So it's so important to understand that. And we produced this short documentary film with our colleague, Mr. Graham Peebles, who is a UK-based, author and charity worker. And this film called "We're Still Breathing:
Hmm.
Amhara Genocide in Ethiopia." This was something that we showed in a number of cities and is now available on YouTube.
Hmm.
And I just want to invite people. I mean, if you get a chance, please tune into this documentary. It's very short, just less than 25 minutes, and it covers really the victim testimony from survivors of what happened in Welkait. This was released a couple of years ago, but it's still very much relevant now because
Hmm.
the subject matter, it's still happening, it's actively happening. What's happening to the people in the Welkait area is still ongoing. So crucial to highlight this, and for those who conduct themselves in advocacy or education or any type of work to educate people about what's happening in Ethiopia, this can be a very valuable resource. So maybe in the future, we'll see if we can get a dedicated discussion about that. But this brings me to my question, Jamal, which is, do you feel international media has adequately covered the suffering of Amhara and Afar people? Why or why not?
No, they haven't. No, they haven't. And it goes back to let's call it the Berlin Kissinger directive. It's like you can't sit there when you decided that these people need to be minimized and these people can't be given the spotlight or they can't be given the mic. They cannot return to power. They just need to be destroyed. Um, it's going to like sift through the way in which people gather information or told information, et cetera, et cetera. It's like when I talk about what happened at the Northern Star Hotel and the journalists that I encountered who were coming from outside of Ethiopia to report on the war and how they had been briefed about the severity of the situation in Tigray, even though Tigray was under the ENDF control loosely. And nobody spoke anything about Amhara. Nobody, and people actually, I keep going back to this one journalist. I was like, you need to go to Mai-Kadra because what I discovered in Mai-Kadra and what you're hearing about Mai-Kadra are two different things. He's like, yeah, I'll get to it. Like he didn't care, you know? So my thing is, from the Berlin, also the Berlin decisions, Berlin conference influence decisions, the decisions of the Italians, the Catholic Church, from all the way to Kissinger through to Anthony Blinken, it's like you have such a wall of resistance up against the Amhara people. And a lot of journalists nowadays don't want to climb that wall, or they don't know how to climb that wall. They don't know how to do the independent research. They don't have access to it. One of the downfalls of what happens in the community is that everything is in Amharic. A lot of truth is not accessible because it's not in English, right? So it's like when I sit and I see something come across, and I have someone who can translate for me in the house instantly. Everybody doesn't have that. And the thing is, I can't send this to a bureau chief that I know of based in Nairobi or somebody that I know of that's closer in the region to be like, hey, you need to go hop on this story. Because they don't have access to the language. We don't have access to the story. So I've seen major things. I mean, you think about the Chena Debark massacre, for instance. Who had access to it? AFP covered it because Emmanuel was an Ethiopian who is Orthodox, who understood the story and heard about it, and he went there, right? But it's like it took me some time to get there, just because I was in the States at the time that it occurred. But at the same time, it's like if it wasn't for the AFP, I had like maybe 5 or 6 other Ethiopian outlets reporting it, but in Amharic. And so the access to the story is not there. You know, um, there is the bias. I mean, there is the Christian bias, the Orthodox Christian bias as well. There is the black skin bias. There is the bias that's created within the halls of the State Department and political entities in the West. It's like, oh, the Amhara are always talking. Yeah, 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 yeah. Getachu's our man. Go listen to Getachew. Getachew is going to be the one who's going to give you the information. You know what I mean? So I laugh, and it's like, I do think about that when I approached a senior person at the AP to kind of have a discussion about one of his journalists who was kind of reporting blatant inaccuracies. Um, they just listened, and I was like, yeah, this person is either being woefully misled or is purposely dragging your name through the mud in East Africa because they're bought and paid for. And I had to kind of say it like that, and I know I might have offended them, but I was like, whatever. The truth is, it's just like there's a lot of stuff coming out that you guys you're dropping the ball on. It's not the truth, you know. Uh,
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's such
yeah.
an important point, Brother Jamal. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, over the past few years, just looking back at my personal encounters with some of these offices and, different people, I'm not going to name anyone here, but um, it's this recurring pattern of either, willful ignorance or, complete like indifference where they have their own kind of mission of what to be interested in or what to report on. And some part of that also, I think, is uh, a lack of organized truth telling and education from
Mm-hmm.
our part, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
that's a gap that we're trying to address. Me and my colleagues at the Amhara Association of America have been doing advocacy work for the past number of years. And a lot of that is addressing, for example, the reporting gap, right? Like more English language reporting about what's happening and getting that reporting to the right stakeholders and then sitting down with them and explaining and also being consistent in that engagement. So sometimes people get into the trap of, I'm going to send an email, I'm going to show up to their office once, and then I'm going to think that they're going to remember my case and my grievance for the next couple of years. Well, that's not the case,
Mm-hmm.
especially in today's world where there's crises, there's fires happening in all corners, you
Mm-hmm.
know, news disappears fast. So we need sustained, continued engagement. And that's not something that one individual, one organization, or even few organizations can do. Has to be a concerted, organized effort on a large scale. And to
Mm-hmm.
scale up, we need to, empower people, I think, at a local level to, you know, do this work as ambassadors, where everyone's an ambassador. They're not, necessarily a subject matter expert, but just by virtue of being tuned into this space, everyone has a certain degree of knowledge, and especially to be able to explain that to someone who has no understanding or very little exposure to Ethiopia, it doesn't take an expert. So it's very very important to make that case very very clear. And I'm seeing a comment: "Where is AAA when needed the most?" Well, my friends, we've been around active on a daily basis, so I think if you have missed us, check social media, follow our socials, and hopefully you can get a sense of the work that's been done. So I think sometimes there's also a knowledge gap. Some people are just not tuned into the right sources. But Brother Jamal, you also mentioned a couple of very dark episodes in the Northern War. One of
Mm-hmm.
them being Jena Tekla Haimanot, and the other one being Kobo, if I heard it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And these were two of the particular mass unalivings. I'm being careful with my wording here because of TikTok has a very strict
Mm-hmm.
algorithm. But these were two of the largest or most widely covered mass unalivings next to Mai-Kadra. And it was picked up by a limited number of news outlets, especially at a time when the war was happening in Amhara and
Mm-hmm.
in Afar. The
Mm-hmm.
majority of the war took place in these regions.
Hmm.
So it's very important for us not to have a short memory and to recall that because, we have to give weight to that. This is where we say what's happening in RC now isn't isolated. This has been happening. This is something that's been happening all over the country, and we
Hmm.
have to remember the victims and give value and to remember each and every one because they're not just statistics; these were real people.
Hmm.
Let me move on to my next question. I've been talking for some time.
Okay.
Um, so, what role can books, photography, and independent documentation play in the pursuit of accountability?
They create a record and a standard by which people can be held accountable and be called to answer, be called to the floor. I keep going back to some of the photos throughout my life that have basically been game changers, so to speak. And people had to answer for that. People ultimately, whether it took, 2 years or 10 years or 50 years, people had to answer for what was captured, what was pictured, what was written about. Um, it's crucial once again. I'm going to always lean on and favor the visual. The writing is lovely, it's incredible, it's needed, but the visual is impactful and it's strong and it's there. And to think about once again the photos that live with me in my mind from Vietnam. I was born in 1969. And when I look back, it was my father's involvement during his last tour of duty and his collection of photos and his love of photography that kind of just did something to me. And I really saw the importance of just what the image does and what it brings, and why we need to have images at all costs. There need to be images. It's not just writing. There need to be images, video and images. Um, um, it's a crucial part of the story. It's absolutely crucial part of the story. If you have an empathetic bone in your body, you can look at photos and you can identify with the subject. Um, you can look at like some of these photos. I showed my book to one of our elders in the community, and he said that the images have already just kind of stuck in his head, and they inspired a kind of a deep sorrow within him. During the exhibitions of Tears of Walega, when I was traveling with it, there were people, there were Ferengi, there were these young college kids in North Carolina who looked at these pictures and were just like, my God, what the hell is this? I don't even hear about this in the news. I mean, I can't even tell you how many times during I think I did like 12 exhibition stops of the exhibit, if not more. How many times people would say, I never heard of this. I never knew this was going on. What's a Walega? Where's Walega? Why is this girl crying? Or why are these people just sitting here looking so sorrowful? I mean, what is this about? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of like shock that people were just so unaware of what was happening in Ethiopia, um, when they consider themselves living in one of the most media savvy environments in the world, being so aware and so knowledgeable of things. Um, so yeah, it's incredibly crucial. Absolutely. And I think that we need to instill within our young journalists, regardless of what direction the industry goes, that as you write, even if it's a cell phone photograph, you have to document visually what's going
Mhm.
on.
Very good point. Very, very good point. And I'm sure there will be platforms where we can deliver these messages directly to our colleagues, but many of them are just a text message away. So I think this is something that we need to really share with them. Our journalist colleagues are people who, Amhara journalist colleagues are people who are very important in getting information out there to the public. So it's so crucial that we practice best practices and see what we can do to make their jobs easier, to make sure our community is well informed and is aware of everything that's happening. So thank you for that, Brother Jemal. A couple of related questions. So I'm going to try and ask them together, but if it gets too much, you can just, choose one. Okay.
I got you. I got you.
The first part is, for diaspora communities watching this live, what is the most constructive way to amplify these stories? And then the next part is, what do you want policymakers or human rights advocates to take away from this book?
Okay, diaspora basically needs to thoroughly educate themselves on what's going on. Um, I think this recent episode in RC is probably one where the bulk of, well, I won't say the bulk of, a large number of diaspora are well aware of what's going on because we've been inundated with the information, right? And now that people are realizing that, if you don't pay attention, you're going to be exterminated, period. I think that that's the reality that people need to understand. If you don't pay attention, they're going to kill you off and rewrite your story, right? So we need to, I know it's tiring. I know it's traumatizing. I know that it can induce things that people really are afraid of dealing with. But you got to educate yourselves, The history of RC. How many times were there attacks in RC? Why? What's happening in RC? Where is RC? Why do we have this existence? Why are we being persecuted in a country that is our own? It's not like, and I go back to South Africa because I was just there, but a couple months ago. But it's not like you're somebody coming from, the northern parts of Zimbabwe, crossing the border underneath a fence and finding yourself in Johannesburg, opening a fruit stand, and you're an outsider, quote unquote, that's undocumented. You are living in your own country. I know people who have relatives, people who are Gunduri, who have relatives from Showa, who have relatives from Gojam, who have relatives from, as far as Adigrat, Shiri. There are people who, through marriage and through just normal family growth and cohesion, have relatives everywhere. You're native to Ethiopia. You're citizens of Ethiopia, but yet you're stateless. I mean, you can't live safely in large swaths of the country because of ethnic federalism, deeply infected tribal ideologies, and Western induced propaganda that make you fight each other, make you hate each other, So education is needed, thorough education, painful education, because you don't want to look at the images, but you're going to have to look at the images. Policymakers need to kind of deal with a reckoning. It's like a lot of this is all about geopolitical control. It's about, the Horn of Africa. Who's going to be our watchdog? Who's going to watch our flank? Who's going to watch the Red Sea? Can we basically put a large scale base there so we can attack the Houthis, or so we can monitor shipping through the Red Sea, or so X, Y, and Z? You know what I mean? So policymakers need to really think about it. It's just like, if we want to be the free world, the great modernized West, the super humanitarian group of people, then you got to rethink what you're doing, because what you're doing is actually causing vast amounts of bloodshed. You're talking about, watching the Red Sea. You're filling the Red Sea with our blood, because, these policies are absurd. They're ridiculous, and it goes back to the natural resource game. It goes back to, supporting the puppet that will endorse your policies and allow for the implementation of GMO crops and, sell your women into slavery in other countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Supporting the weakest link, just because it gets you free access to our resources, that needs to change. And that's about a moral change. And, I don't know if some people are up to the challenge.
Well said. I mean, these are tough questions to ask, Brother Jemal, but really, this is the reality of what we're facing, the geopolitics of it, and the realities of, migration. Where there's war, where there's instability, you have a migrant crisis. and you have our brothers and sisters who are making very harsh journeys to, hostile countries where they have to live in very terrible conditions sometimes, right? And this is all because their country of birth is in crisis. This is
Hmm.
something that's been intergenerational for many of us, with parents who immigrated, decades ago and led to diaspora like myself, so it's something that is a very real problem which we have yet to address, but needs to be part of the discussion for sure. Um, but I want to pivot back to some reflection and specifically back to the subjects of the book. And
Hmm.
I wanted to ask if you could speak directly to the families whose stories appear in the book.
Mm.
What would you want them to know?
Like I said before, I haven't forgotten you. Um, and there are several instances where um, I would leave IDP camps. And I understand that most of them now don't want to be called IDPs, they want to be called survivors. I left survivors camps, and people would be like, do not forget us. Do not forget to tell these stories because so many people have come through for a soundbite and just kept it moving and didn't come back to who their subject was or the pain and suffering their subject was enduring. So I remember there was a great deal of concern and resentment by the survivors of Mai-Kadra because so many people had come. Once it became an issue, they went to Mai-Kadra to get sound bites, and they forgot those people. You know, I don't know who else went to Chena Debark. I don't know how many other people talked about Chena Debark, Chena Tekla, the story. But for me, I thought that should have been front and center for most of the Orthodox world. It's like you basically commit a massacre on Tekla Hamaynat itself with the tablet out. You machine gun people while the tablet is crossing the threshold of the church. I really felt like everybody should have known that. Everybody, you know. And so when you're talking to a priest who has buried his son and wife who were killed in that instance, and he gave me his time, you know, and he spared that much time to sit with me and talk, and through the other priest, talk about his story and relate it. No, no, you need to really talk about that. Um, yeah, I lost train. I get
No
carried
problem.
away.
No
Just
problem.
repeat the question again, or just give me the gist again.
So
Sorry.
the question was, if you could speak directly to the families whose stories appear in the book, what would you want them to know?
Okay. Aside from that, it's like I would tell them like I am trying to work towards justice for you. I understand there needs to be justice for you. The sad thing is I don't know where Alamu Bayeni is. Right? We lost track of him. He moved away from the camp after, and we heard that he was, somewhere in Gojam, and then we just lost track of him. Um, but I've carried his story on everywhere I go, and I will do so until my dying day. There needs to be justice. There will be justice if we really seek justice for our brothers and sisters, but there needs to be justice. I think that should be the driver for everybody who is listening, who wants to participate in remedying this situation and seeking justice for the Amhara people and for the Afar people, for our Orthodox family. There needs to be justice, and that should be the primary focus of our mission. We need to be focused on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very well said, Brother Jamal. And on that note, I mean, about the persecution of the Amhara and the Orthodox Christian followers, I mean, it didn't end with Jinnah. It didn't end with Mai-Kadra. If you look at what happened during the war, if you look at what happened in places like Debre Elias, if you look at
Mm.
what's happening even now in Raya Alamata,
Hmm.
this is something that is a nationwide issue. And it's not something that we should limit to one part of the country. This is something that's facing these people across the country. So we need to talk about it all. We need to understand that it's all very much connected. And with that being said, I want to go into just closing questions, Brother Jemal, and then if you have time, maybe a couple of questions from the audience, if you think it's a good idea.
That's fine. That's fine.
Excellent. So, guys, if you are in the audience and you do want to ask questions for our brother Jemal, please send your requests, and we're going to just ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to move to audience questions. So, just a heads up, okay, guys? And so, the first closing question is, so what do you think justice looks like for the communities that are documented in this book?
Um, Return and restoration. Um, People lived where they lived, regardless of where they were from, what caused them to be relocated to wherever. First off, I'd want people to return or go where they feel comfortable. Some people who left Walega may not want to return to Walega. Let's figure out the best option where they will be safe, where they can prosper. I hate even using anything related to the words prosper, prosperity, but where they will be safe, where they can enjoy a safe and comfortable life and grow safe and comfortable communities. I think that's the main objective. Restoration. People have had land stolen. They've been forced off land. As best we can get to restoring what they had before. I think about now. I'm just going to kind of just change directions a little bit. You know, I bounced between Atlas, Saluta, Piazza, and Addis-Ababa. Don't shoot me for mispronouncing Addis-Ababa, please. But I lived in Piazza. I lived just walking, having the weekends, you know, taking my kid to get ice cream, you know, patronizing the merchants, just kind of hanging out. And that's all gone. These people live 25 miles away from where the city is. 25 miles, 20 miles from where Piazza is. And granted, they've been given shelter. They've been given unfinished condos. They've been given structures that don't have running water or electricity where hyenas roam. They should be given the right or given the choice to return as close to Piazza as possible. And also to just be compensated for what was lost. Yeah, I mean, it infuriates me, actually. It infuriates me. I mean, I had some of the most beautiful times before we moved to the U.S. In Ethiopia, in Piazza, in our neighborhoods, just not even really leaving the neighborhood. You know, a very simple life of sharing with my photo students, going to church, and spending time with family and neighbors. You know, and that's all disrupted. If I were to move back to any of the homes that I lived in before we moved, half of that infrastructure will be gone. You know, I know people who had just built houses in Arad Kilo who had them demolished because of a bike lane or need for this economic growth or replenishment or environmental, whatever, you know? So we need to really figure that out, honestly. And it's something that needs to be addressed regardless of how painful some of it may seem to be financially, fiscally, you know?
Very well said, dear brother. And we had some comments about the pronunciation, but I think you did fine. You know, there's so many different neighborhoods and everything, so I think people understood the gist of it. I think that puts us in a good place just to ask one more question before moving to some of the audience questions. I've invited some great folks to the listener side. And my last question, Brother Jemal, is where can people purchase the book and support your work overall, or rather follow your work?
Okay, well, the link is on my bio. I shared the link in the comments, but I'll make sure the link is in my bio on all of my social media platforms. I shared the book link on X a couple days ago. It's shared on both of my Instagram accounts, and I shared it here on TikTok. I'm trying to put it on my website, both my personal portfolio website and the Tears of Wood Lego website. But technical issues. I don't understand why these guys just can't put code, make it so simple to put a little bit of code onto a website that's engineered to, you know, sell content, whatever. Anyway, I'm going to work that out this week. So you can follow me here on TikTok. You can follow me on Instagram at Jemal Countess Photography. You can follow me on X, Jemal Countess, and my website dedicated to everything that I covered during the war is tearsofwoodlega.org. And tearsofwoodlega.org is simply a resource for the community to show the rest of the world what you endured through the occupation of the Amhara and Afar regions, some of the various unalivings, mass unalivings, and oppressive situations that you endured. So it's a source of, it's a photo source. Its captions are written, but it's all photography. It's all photos. So it's meant for people who want to write articles, who want to have discussions. If you want to go to your local congressman, congressional leader, whatever, and you want to take 3 or 4 photos from, let's say, Chenna or Sakota or from Amhara trips or what have you, that's your source to do that. You know, communication with me, of course, to help generate the larger files that would be needed for publication.